So adaptive database design is not a new topic, but it remains a hot topic today. As clinical trials are becoming more and more complex, traditional design practices are becoming less efficient. By implementing a flexible design, you can quickly and efficiently implement new changes downstream with minimal impact to existing data. Adaptive design as a whole is too substantial a topic to discuss in one breakout session. So today we're going to focus on adaptive dose finding and look at two real-world examples where we transformed two phase 1 oncology trials to be flexible midstream after go live. So in 2018, the FDA released two guidance documents to help modernize clinical trials and increase the success and effectiveness of drugs and biologics. In these documents, they defined what an adaptive design is. And as you see here, it's a clinical trial design that allows for prospectively planned modifications to one or more aspects of the design based on accumulating data from subjects in the trial. Keyword here is accumulating. You'll see that as a constant theme throughout this presentation and in some of our real-world examples. Okay. So with an adaptive design or flexible design is different than a traditional design that we're accustomed to. With a traditional design, the study is designed, conducted, and then analyzed at the end. But with this adaptive flexible design studies, the study is conducted, and while it's being conducted, review and analysis is continually going on, and modifications are being made to patient treatments and the design. This presents a lot of challenges, especially from a design perspective. Some of the challenges you'll see, and you'll see in some of our real-world examples, are changing in dose schedules, dose escalation and expansion cohorts, adding, removing therapies and treatment arms, crossover therapy options, change in administration and route and delivery method, and changing eligibility requirements. These are just some of the changes you'll see, and many of these you'll see in our real-world examples, but there's more beyond this. And these present a challenge when designing a database up front. So what does the data show about complex design? In 2014, Medidata wanted to see if there was a correlation between trial complexity and the number of migrations. And they based trial complexity on the number of unique CRFs, edit checks, derivations, custom functions. So the more edit checks, unique CRFs, custom functions, they suspected there would be more migrations, and that's what they found. And everybody knows migrations equal time, money, and risk. So by implementing a flexible design up front, you can lower the number of CRFs, derivations, and custom functions, and in turn, hopefully, reduce your migrations. So who benefits from a flexible design? Well, the site no longer has to wait for cease data entry in order to enter their data, waiting for database updates. Once the flexible database is implemented, whether it's initially with go live or midstream, like in our examples, once it's implemented, the workflow should stay consistent throughout the life of the study. For the sponsor, the lessened complexity will reduce cost and shorten deliveries. It will provide the ability to pivot the emerging data and allow for seamless phases. And for the CRO, it gives the CRO the ability to be advanced in their design and reduce EDC changes downstream, which will in turn reduce resourcing constraints and allow for reusability across multiple trials. So what does flexibility mean for the overall trial design? Emerging data, again, we saw this earlier as accumulating data. And basically means learning along the way as the data review can lead to potential changes in the treatment and the database. For the protocol needs to be written adaptively and leave the flexibility in the door is open to be flexible with your design. And in designing, you really need to review the protocol as a whole. It's so easy to just look at the schedule of assessments and the footnotes and design off of that, but a lot of this adaptive language you'll see in our examples are not written in those areas. For the site, as mentioned earlier, no more suspension of data entry while waiting for database updates, and reduced data misplacement because they can't find a home for the data. And then future casting, which is the key to flexible design. Thinking downstream and not in the present. Even though don't just look at what our needs are now. What can we potentially see down the road, and can we implement it now while we're making an update or in our initial design? And it's key to have all stakeholders, clinical and data management, involved early in the design process. And so, as mentioned, it's key to have everybody collaborate and get together early in the design. Things to consider: trial complexity. Does the protocol leave the door open to be flexible? And can we anticipate what potential future changes may occur? On top of that, is it feasible with all this coordination and collaboration to still meet our delivery timelines? And then our two real-world examples were flexible databases implemented midstream, so after go live. So in that case, you want to balance out return on investment, because these, implementing it midstream is a lot of work and a lot of time, but hopefully it'll lead to reduced costs and efficiencies for the life of the trial. So what to expect for the flexible database design? Reduced amendments, reduced database updates, reduced migrations, shortened timelines and deliveries, reduced costing, resourcing, and fluid data entry. What does it require? Again, cross-team collaboration and coordination. We can't put this point home enough. It really takes everybody to get together and think about the design up front and creatively. An adaptive protocol, of course, you need. Additional site training. Most sites are going to be accustomed to a traditional design. And increased reliance on the sites to be able to understand the adaptive design and workflow. Communication with all parties and vendors is important, especially midstream again. You want to think about other integrations with the database and the changes you're implementing, how they'll affect those other integrations. And then it requires the sites to be on top of late or missed visits for these continual data reviews by the DMC. So now we're going to get into a real-world example, and I'll let Herm explain our first case study.
Hi, everyone. So the first case study we're going to use is, we're going to call it CDK9. It's a phase 1 open-label oncology trial, a dose-finding study. Initially, it's monotherapy. The dosing is fixed, and the dosing schedule is dosing over 2 consecutive days, and then 12 days off. And the visits were fixed cycle folders. So what that means is, in a traditional design, you have your, within the cycle, day 1, day 2, and then additional days for safety labs, et cetera, during the dose escalation. And these were 2-week cycles. Then once they hit the target dose and were on treatment, they were 28-day cycles, 4 weeks long, and dosing on days 1 and 2 and 15 and 16. And once, the way it was built, once the site enters the visit date, then it adds all the forms that would need to be completed at that visit. There have been, along the way, there are a number of amendments. The dosing schedule did change because they did change it to weekly dosing, and I'll get to why in just a bit. And then, it was still a dose escalation initially of 8 weeks and then 4-week target cycles, but we needed to make it flexible with the change to the weekly. And then there were more protocol amendments where currently we're adding combination therapy. The dose escalation is still weekly, but now the dose escalation period is only 4 weeks, and the target dose cycles, they changed to 3 weeks. The reason they changed to 3 weeks from 4 weeks was to be more in line with what's out there in practice. So how do we implement this flexibility? Because they said, well, we're going to move to weekly dosing, but we have dosing on days 1 and 2. How are you going to enter data like that? Additionally, they were initially not going to issue a protocol amendment, and we kept asking, why not? Because you're changing the schedule of events with the dosing. But the passage here from the protocol was their justification as to why they weren't issuing immediately a protocol amendment. They were just going to issue a clarification letter, but basically it says that even though dosing is supposed to happen over 2 consecutive days, there are times when that may not be able to happen because of adverse events or other situations. But as long as they receive 2 doses over a 14-day period, that's okay. So what this outlines here is, like I said, the fixed cycles, the days with the forms as expected for the schedule of events. So now we're going to enter day 8 dosing. We're changing to weekly under day 2. And see the day 8, because that's just safety labs, there's no dose administration form there. So how can we go about, making an update without a protocol amendment? So I'm going to hand it back to Brian so he can walk you through that.
Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, so the struggle was, in these cases where the subject wasn't going to receive dose on day 1 or 2, where do they record the data? And in addition, up there it says on any 2 days, so it could be really any days in a 2-week period. So we implemented a repeating folder for the ramp-up visits. And this is kind of a bird's eye view of the subject calendar. But basically, day 1 was static. The subject's going to always receive treatment at day 1, and the forms are going to always be the same there. At the time, again, this was midstream. There was also a lot of edit checks tied to that visit. And so since we didn't see it changing much, we kept that as a static visit. But then we implemented a repeating folder for ramp up, where the sites can just enter as many visits they need, because they may need to enter assessment visits between the next dosing, because it's no longer consecutive. So it's a repeating folder. We append the visit number, which gets entered on the ECRF, which we'll get to in a minute. And also, we put a derivation in to identify which visits are dosing visits. So, gives you a bird's eye view quickly to see where the second dosing occurred from the subject calendar. So we have 2 trigger forms, basically. They essentially could be one. The one on the right is a central local lab, ECRF, which was already an approved form with Acerta, and because this design wasn't going to be implemented across all the studies, we wanted to leave this trigger form alone, and we created a new trigger form to generate any other potential forms that could be needed within the visit. And you'll see the dose administration form on there. So the site will select what visit number it is, and populate whichever forms they need for that visit, similar to the unscheduled trigger form that many of us are accustomed to. And then the visit number and the data visit will append to the folder name and whether it's dosing or not. So just to go back here, for cycle A ramp up, after day 1, there was 5 more visits. And it looks, so it looks like visit 2, 3, there's 2 3s. But were assessment visits. The subject was dosed on day 4, likely another assessment visit before they moved on to cycle B, day 1. So this, not knowing where the subject could potentially be dosed and even by cohort, it wasn't like cohort A is going to get dosed on 1 and 7, and it was really, the subject could be dosed even in the same cohort on any 2 days within that 14-day cycle. This seemed to be the best way to handle that. Another thing we encountered with the protocol and the initial design of the database was the PK sampling. So the PK form was initially set up as a fixed time point form, and when this amendment was coming around, they were talking about, I think, collecting for day 8 or 9 hours or 8 hours. And then in reviewing the protocol, we noticed this language in the protocol, and again, this wasn't in the schedule of assessments under the PK form footnote. This was in just a table discussing PK sampling, but it says the timing and frequency of the pharmacokinetic samples may be adjusted during the study dependent upon emerging data. So as data emerges, these time points and frequency can change. So we would constantly have been making database updates if we just updated the two current time points and need 8 or 9 hours. So after discussing, and collaborating with everybody, we decided it would be best to retire this form and create a new PK form. And we talked with clinical and said, what potential infusion time points could you possibly see even down the road? And we just populated all those into a drop-down list. And now the site just enters it one by one, so that handles the problem with frequency. So these were just a couple examples of what we did on one of the studies. And here's our second case study, and I'll let Herm jump back in here.
Okay, so we're going to call this case study MCL1. It's another phase 1 open label dose-finding oncology study. In this case, we started with one arm, and it's one arm based on indication or type of disease. We had 4 cohorts by dose level. The dosing, we had initially escalation weekly over 4 weeks to start, and it could increase as the dose level got higher. And then during once they reached the target dose, then it's weekly dosing 3 weeks. And again, we had fixed weekly cycle folders where they enter the visit date, and it just adds, the forms expect for day 1, day 8, day 15, or during dose escalation, week 1, week 2, week 3, et cetera. And then there were a number of amendments where the second arm was added based again on indication. And then there were 7 cohorts now, again, based on dose level. Now, the dosing changed slightly because they were moving from weekly dose escalation to daily or accelerated dose escalation. And then the target dose were weekly, but then they introduced another cohort where they were comparing weekly or once weekly dosing to biweekly or dosing twice a week. And the visits were going to be flexible based on the type of dose acceleration and then the target dosing schedule. And then we ended up with, now we have mono and combo therapy. We have 14 cohorts, again, based on dose levels. And then the dosing, daily escalation, we don't have weekly dose escalation anymore. And then the target cycles are weekly and bi-weekly, and it may change again over the course of the study. What we're going to concentrate here on is the change from the weekly dose escalation to the daily dose escalation, because, okay, we have week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4 folders. But now we have day 1, day 2, and it could go as far as day 28, depending on circumstances like adverse events, drug holidays, et cetera. But basically, the dosing is 4 days and slightly increasing until they get to the target dose at day 8 or cycle 1, day 1. So I'm going to turn it back to Brian to see how we solve that problem.
Yeah, so we knew we were going to daily ramp up, but again, if in looking at the protocol language and what's highlighted there, intrapatient dose escalation and cohort escalation scheme have the flexibility to be amended based on emerging PK data. So, even when we're looking at the current amendment and their dosing on days 2, 3, 4, this language here is saying that that has the potential to change. So, again, how do we incorporate that change into our design now so we're not constantly updating the database and having tons of migrations? And so in this study, we was a little different. We talked with again ClinOps and basically said, give us an idea how far out you think the days could potentially go, even down the road, down the pipeline. And I think we go out 20 or so days. Not that the site has to do that, but so with the data visit form, if the visit occurred, they get this new form that we implemented, which was a treatment day form. And it basically just asks if the subject is receiving treatment at that visit. If they were receiving treatment, the dose administration form plus the PK and PD, which are required for dosing visits, would generate. If they were not receiving treatment, then your standard assessment forms would appear. And then within each day, we have the continuation form, and it will ask if the subject's continuing on interpatient dosing. If yes, it'll then generate the next day, and they can, if it's an assessment visit, they say no to the treatment form, and only the assessment forms come up. If it's a treatment visit, they would say yes. And then when dose escalation is complete and they hit their target dose, they would say, they would enter no for the first question and yes to if the subject will continue to cycle 1, and that will move them on to treatment. So in our subject calendar over here, we did similar to CDK9, where the day gets appended along with the visit date, and then if it was a dosing visit or not. So here looks like day 1 would have been an assessment visit, and then the subject was dosed on day 2 and 3, and then dosed again on day 5, and then 6 was an assessment visit before they moved on to treatment cycle. So this was how we kind of handled the various dosing in this study. We also had the same problem with PK and ECG and fixed time points on this study. And we did the same thing. We retired the old forms, moved to a new, more flexible form to handle changes downstream. So in summary, keys to success and things to think about with a flexible database design. Think ahead and try to future cast. Don't think just about the needs we need now for the database, what can potentially be down the pipeline. Analyze the protocol for the adaptive language again. It's not always as clear as the footnotes and the schedule of assessments. Collaborate and communicate with all stakeholders during the initial design. And even post go live, if you have a migration coming up, it doesn't hurt to see if there may be some changes down the road that we can implement now. Include all the stakeholders in online screen review and take advantage of UAT to ensure everybody's participating cohesively at the appropriate times. These designs are very complex. You don't want to have to overhaul them at the last minute. And as far as some things to consider with Rave, in building for the future, you could potentially hide some things and use the publish check feature down the road instead of Amendment Manager. Amendment Manager, as many of us know, is not a quick process. Typical migrations take 2 to 3 weeks for a standard one, whereas a publish check at Apereo, we can do a publish check in 2 to 3 days. So that's one way to implement design in the future, but not necessarily put it in the design itself right away. Also try to design, adding on to that, adding in future cohorts and treatments, which is what we did on MCL1. Use of the repeating visits and folders, which we saw on CDK9, that could be an option. Note though, if you're using balance, that is not a good option. The repeating folders will cause problems with the supply triggers. You could also use custom functions to trigger forms by cohort. So if the forms are changing by the cohort, you can just update the custom function and do a publish check. In our case, it wasn't by cohort, it was by subject that the dosing could change, so that really wasn't an option. And then lastly, I'd say avoid fixed time points, because even in non-flexible, non-adaptive protocols, it seems like the time points constantly change and you're updating them all the time. Yeah.
And before we move on to questions and answers, just want to say that, the keys to success, I think we have been successful. One of the challenges or concerns we had, and I think the team had, is if we're moving to those forms, the PK form where the site has to select, all the time points and then keep adding lines for each, are they going to have an uproar and say, we don't want to do all that work? But generally, they've been able to adapt and we haven't heard many complaints. It was definitely a collaborative effort between, the study team at Acerta and the team at Apereo. And then lastly, just another real-world example about how for the dose escalation, we get a protocol amendment for the combo therapy, so we're working on that. And then in the middle of that, then another protocol amendment came out because there was a safety signal. And they had to put one of the cohort treatments on hold and figure out, well, what do we need to do? And so in that cohort level during dose escalation, they were only dosing days 1, 2, and 3. Now they were adding another intermediate level at day 4. And initially I thought, oh, we have to do another database amendment to add day 4. But then Brian said, no, it's just that treatment trigger form. And so I tested and he was right. We don't have to, do an amendment to add day 4 in that one treatment cohort. It's already accounted for. And I showed that to the team, and they were very happy about that for that specific change, that we don't have to do another update and database migration. So that in addition to questions, like if there are any situations in your real world where you've had to think a little bit outside the box or do something a little different in terms of database design, we'd love to hear your stories.
We can turn this on. Thanks. Thank you for coming, and we have the opportunity to ask questions and share stories as well as get some clarity. Does anybody here have a question that they'd like to have answered or have ideas to share? Yep. Let me come back there. And maybe he's not raising his hand. You're not raising your hand. Okay. You just bought the Audi, so who has a question? There we go.
Okay, I have a question about the dynamic form, the solution to your first problem, regarding the one where site has to select what forms they want to populate in the scheduled visit. So I noticed that there's the safety and lab assessments. However, I think that is there potential for that to cause any kind of like data entry or confusion from the site? And if so, do you have any kind of workaround? Like, are there edit checks in place to check what assessments are being populated at the correct visit per the SOE? Or is that something that's manually reviewed?
So if I understand your question, the question is like, what if they don't pick the correct forms, if they select a form that maybe wasn't needed at a particular visit?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we don't have edit checks in place for that. It's more of a manual review.
By putting the edit checks in, you're, again, adding complexity to it, and you can't be as flexible because now you're going to have to update those edits based on, potential changes. But the site is working off a source, so if they, the source should really be their guide, and EDC is capturing it. So there could be there shouldn't be many data entry issues, and I believe in talking with Herm and also our DM on one of these studies at Apereo. She feels that there's been kind of less data entry issues, or about the same that you would normally have, but the sites are loving it because they don't have to wait to enter their data. They can just populate it when they need it, and they're working off a source, so
right.
It should be.
I will also say that when I've gone and looked at data, that I will sometimes see queries from the monitor saying, they're doing their monitoring, they notice, oh, you haven't entered this, you'll need to update this to add that form so that because it was done, that procedure was done at this particular visit.
Great question. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Yes.
So when you switch from default PK to the drop-down PK, your existing data, you must have already lost that, right?
No.
Did you take that?
No, we did not lose because, I think please correct me if I'm wrong, but.
We use the same OIDs, and we just retired a form, so for the existing subjects, the form would not generate anymore. Going forward, the new form would generate, but it was all going, not the same data set, it's separate data sets, but the columns were the same, the variables were the same. If you were to enact, you can go from fixed log to remove the default values and go to a standard log form. If you do that post-go live, during the migration, Amendment Manager will inactivate all of the log lines. And that was going to cause a reconciliation nightmare. We had a lot of data in there already, so we thought it was best to just create a new form and reuse the variables.
But your existing data was lost, wasn't it?
No.
When you inactivate the log line,
No, we didn't enact. The form for the existing subjects just remained where data had already been entered. And going forward, they started, the new form was generated.
Did you consider the possibility of just creating a PK folder and then having the PK defaulted specific to the amendment?
Well, I think that if we had gone that route, that would have been more of a headache because it was already structured that the PK form was within visits. So if we went to a different structure, putting specifically the PK forms in a PK folder, that would have caused a bigger nightmare.
And plus, the PK form needs to be in the visits that they're receiving dose. So that's part of that trigger. If they receive dose, they get the dosing form and also the PK and PD form.
Very good questions. Yes, we have another question over here. I'm hurrying. Sorry. Excuse me. Sorry.
Hi, I think I missed this earlier, but did you mention that this was a study with a single site or multiple sites?
Oh, it's multiple sites.
So did you have any issues where different sites were on different versions of the amendment?
No, we didn't have a problem with that, thank goodness.
So all sites signed on to the amendment at the same time? So
I don't know that they signed on at the same time, but that wasn't, an issue with protocol versions.
yeah, so what I'm getting at is, would the strategy have been different had different sites been on different versions of the amendment at any given point?
I don't think so. Okay, thanks, Rita. I do want to, because of ongoing theme, in addition to emerging data, is collaboration. So Rita used to work with us, so she was definitely involved in this. So thank you.
Thank you.
Terrific. Did Rita want to say anything or no? No.
Come on, Rita.
I just, Brian and Herm, I just want to thank you for presenting this, how should I say, this topic, right? Because as you know, it's dear and close to my heart. And I'm glad to hear that it actually has stood the test of time. Because when we first designed it, we were wondering how site was going to respond because a lot of burden is now on them to decide on what forms, when dosing is going to take place, and there's a lot of things that they have to do when they're used to being spoon-fed, kind of like not spoon-fed, but everything is in a folder. Mm-hmm. So thank you. Well done.
And are there any other questions from the audience here? Do you have? No? Yes.
For your case study, do the site doing 100% SDV?
Yes, they are doing. Question is about 100% SDV, and yes, these studies are both as 100% SDV.
Thank you. Any additional questions? Yes.
The dynamic folder design, for example, based on the date, is appending the folder name, cycle 1, appended with the date, right? Mm-hmm. In that case, we end up with the folder repeating. Also, if you are using like dynamic form, is end up with like form repeating. Then it's very complex while handling the custom function or edit checks. What is your solution? How you handle the situation?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the last part of the question, but I know that you were getting about asking about the folder name that it's appended.
Yes. If you are appending, then you end up with the folder repeat. It means like the instance number is 0, 1, 2, 3, like that, it will be repeating. So while designing the edit checks or custom function, we need to be very careful to mention the form repeat or folder repeat to compare the one visit versus other visit. How you are handling such a situation.
It's not the instance number. You may have missed it on the form itself, but they actually enter what visit it is. The site is entering that number.
If site is entering, still the folder OID is same, but instance name will be appended in the database, behind the database.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
So that will be handled using like repeat number, form repeat or folder repeat. That's how the Rave database is working, right?
Yeah.
So while building the edit checks or custom function, we need to be more careful on like comparing one visit versus other visit or one folder versus other folder, because I face such a situation in the fast. So that's why like we are not going more dynamic approach. We'll end up with other kind of issues.
We haven't come across it yet, but yeah,
I
it's,
face such
you know,
issues
it's-
in the fast.
Yeah, actually in edit checks we have a field repeat number, but you know that edit checks for the instance and form repeats. So it's handling those things is difficult things, right? So
yeah.
Not only the custom function, it is only even report design as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's,
I guess if I'm interpreting this correctly, like we don't do edit checks based on this visit. Is that the concern that you have a duplicate visit folder name or something to that effect? Is that?
Usually, like we used to compare like the visits are chronological order. Okay, in that case, we need to compare like what is the value of the previous visit, what is the visit date enter the current visit on next visit. In that case, we need to go over the form and field and value. The edit checks are custom function. You have to identify based on the form ID or folder ID. So here is coming for repeat, folder repeat or form repeat.
The question is around the repeat of the form in the folder. How are you going to accommodate for the edit checks on that?
oh yeah, so you do have, exactly, you have issues programming some edits, but the day one was really the day of first dose. That is really the field, like cross form wise, that had a lot of edits tied to it, so that's why we didn't put that in the repeating folder. But you do lose that ability to write the edits across the, or having to use custom functions. But there's no perfect way, and when you have such a flexible design like this, where they can constantly just be changing where they dose, it's you got to kind of pick and choose your battles, and. So it will require a lot more manual review, but for the flexibility, I think it outweighs the manual review by the data manager. I mean, Herm hasn't yelled at me too much about having to do some of the review.
No.
And I was just going to add that making sure you manage your complexity. You can make a database do whatever you want it to. Just know that you're going to run into challenges. And like the visit dates, to me, that's a no-brainer you can do manually because it is a visual thing versus programming that many edits or custom functions in the system that could negatively impact the performance of it.
Excellent. Thank you. Any additional questions? Yep. We have one back here. Okay, thank you. Here we go.
Hi, so I'm just curious about the downstream impact, specifically SDTM and ADAM dataset mapping. I'm not sure how far the trials are, but do you foresee or have you seen any downstream impact? Specifically, for example, the PK form. You'll find that you have the initial PK form and the second PK form when you're mapping in SDTM or ADAM, etc.
Well, I think with the PK form, since you brought that up as an example, because we kept the OIDs the same, we didn't change the OIDs when we changed the form format, and we just changed the form OID, but not like the field OIDs. We haven't run into a problem, and stats programming hasn't said anything to me. And every time we do an update, I'm sending the specs to stats programming so that the SDTM can get updated as needed.
Excellent. These are great questions, and there's more conversation to be had as we continue on with the rest of the day and the evening. We really appreciate you being here and providing a great example of how you can have flexible database design. And as I think at the design at the beginning rather than at the end, and keep all your different ideas and considerations up front and shaping that. And you've done a wonderful job of showing us some good examples, so thank you on showing that. So more to come. I think we have a little bit of a break right now. I forgot to look at my calendar, so I can't really tell you where to go or what to be or how to be, but I do know that there's lots of things to learn downstairs at the Innovation Lounge. 4:45 apparently.